so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which I think, frankly, is bad enough on its own, but you're reinterpreting it now to allow the tax credits to flow to Chinese entities. So now U.S. tax dollars are literally subsidizing Chinese battery makers. Why would we want to do that? Why would we want to not only give our adversary our supply chains and our jobs, but pay them to take them from us? Why does that make any sense?
So I would argue, and certainly want to turn to my Deputy Secretary at Treasury, we are not doing that.
How are you not?
The fact that with the 30D tax credit, only 13 models qualify at this point.
The Inflation Reduction Act, which I did not vote for, but nevertheless, the Inflation Reduction Act said clearly that China, if you are a foreign entity of concern, you don't, which includes China, you don't get the taxpayer subsidy. You don't get the 30D subsidy. You don't get the tax break. And yet your rule allows Chinese companies to get the tax break. It loosens up the restrictions. So now we are subsidizing our rivals. I just don't understand. The chairman's asked you about this repeatedly. I don't understand why we would pay Chinese companies to outcompete us.
So I would strongly disagree with that.
Well, that's the problem, right? Is that the law, which again I didn't support, but the law says just no. It says no. And then you come back and say, it's what we lawyers like to call a multi-factor balancing test, which is usually what courts do when they want to get their way. So it's like, oh, well, let's complicate it. We've got all of these different things. And the effect of it is, this has been widely reported. This isn't my opinion. Everybody understands that what it does is it allows Chinese companies, so long as they're not set up within mainland China, but owned and controlled by China, they can now get the tax credit. I just don't understand why we would use our tax money to pay the Chinese to make these vehicles.
So we're not. Only 13 models, again, have qualified for that 30D tax credit. A lot of companies right now, automakers, are scrambling and they're working urgently to make sure that they don't have that.
If your rule had no effect, why would you change it? Why wouldn't you just leave the text of the IRA in place? Why wouldn't you, the flat bar?
All of this is implementing the legislation that's been passed. And happy again to get into the.
But I appreciate that answer, Mr. Turk, but you haven't really answered my question. I mean, let me read you from another article. This is the Associated Press. And this isn't quoting someone, this is just a statement of fact. And I quote, if electric vehicles replace gas-powered ones, most UAW workers, for example, at engine and transmission plants, will lose their jobs. And if lower-paying battery plants aren't union, workers won't have anywhere near the same wages and benefits. So here, my nightmare scenario is that we repeat, because of this administration's climate agenda, climate fixation, I would argue, we repeat and hypercharge the loss of industry we saw in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and we do it all over again. And so the remaining few things that we actually produce in this country, like automobiles, we won't produce anymore. And we may produce a few things, but even those will be co-owned with foreign companies. I mean, you mentioned steel. U.S. Steel, an iconic American company, backbone of our steel production in this country, is apparently about to sell to a foreign company. I hope your administration is going to block that sale. I've urged the president to block it. He should absolutely block it. But for heaven's sake, let's not see what remains of our proud and strong auto industry be completely co-opted by foreign governments, foreign entities, and U.S. workers are left with very little. I mean, that's just a nightmare scenario. Wouldn't you agree?
So I'm a firm believer in playing offense. And I think we're playing offense right now. I think we're being intentional. We're being aggressive. We're being purposeful. The fact that we have 136,000 new jobs.
I don't think giving tax subsidies to Chinese companies is playing offense, Mr. Turk.
250 new jobs in Missouri because of these investments, because of these targeted, directed investments, planning for the future and making sure we're winning and competing against China. China is working incredibly aggressively to dominate.
And your administration is helping them now by giving them these tax subsidies. And we are losing thousands of jobs because of your climate mandates that are forcing our production overseas and gutting our workforce. I don't understand it.
Everything we're doing in this space, and happy to go chapter and verse on all the provisions that we're working on, is to reshore, to make sure that these jobs, to make sure this economic opportunity is U.S. and our allies across the world. We've got a huge economic opportunity here. And the last thing we need to do is sit by idly like what we've done in our country for too long. We're stepping up, we're playing offense, we're winning right now. My biggest fear is that someone puts a brake on it and we're not able to compete. Right now we're competing and we're starting to win.
My biggest fear is that the Wall Street banks, they make a bunch of money on it because they've all invested in these foreign companies, and the foreign companies make a bunch of money on it, and we lose thousands of American jobs and American workers get their pay cut in half.